Welcome to the Spitzen-Körper Thelema. We are reading from Francis Yates's Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, a work that fundamentally altered how scholars understand the intellectual substrate beneath Renaissance magic and, by extension, the genealogy of Western esotericism itself. This passage concerns the moment when a Greek manuscript arrived in Florence around 1460 containing the Corpus Hermeticum, a text purporting to preserve the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary Egyptian sage. What Yates examines here is not merely textual history, but the collision between Christian authority and pagan gnosis, and how that collision generated the intellectual permission structure for Renaissance magic to exist within Christian Europe. The stakes were absolute. If Hermes could be read as a pre-Christian prophet of Christ, then his magical teaching could be rehabilitated. If he could not, then anyone studying his works was trafficking with demons. Yates traces this argument through Lactantius, Augustine, and finally Cosimo de' Medici's extraordinary decision to have Marsilio Ficino translate Hermes before Plato, putting the Egyptian magus ahead of Greek philosophy itself in the queue of Renaissance learning. This is the moment when Western esotericism becomes philosophically respectable in the eyes of orthodox power. The passage belongs to the tradition of Renaissance intellectual history inaugurated by Jacob Burckhardt and refined by Paul Oscar Christella, but Yates adds a crucial element. She reads the Hermetic revival not as an antiquarian curiosity but as a transformative force. Where others saw Renaissance magicians as confused Platonists dabbling in superstition, Yates recognized them as inheritors of a conscious, coherent alternative theology, one that claimed to predate and underlie Christianity itself. The perfect word, or sermo perfectus, is a correct translation of the original Greek title of the Asclepius, and the passage which Lactantius quotes in Greek corresponds roughly to a passage in our Latin translation. Thus the Asclepius, the work which contains the weird description of how the Egyptians fabricated their idols and the lament for the Egyptian religion, becomes sanctified because it contains a prophecy concerning the Son of God. It was not only in the Asclepius that the Hermetic writers used the expression Son of God. At the beginning of Bamunda, which is the Hermetic account of creation, the act of creation is said to be through a luminous word, who is the Son of God. When discussing the Son of God as the creative word, with quotations from the scriptures, Lactantius brings in Gentile confirmation, pointing out that the Greeks speak of him as the Logos, and also Trismegistus. He was doubtless thinking of the passage on the creative word as the Son of God in the Pimunda, and he adds that Trismegistus, who by some means or other searched into almost all truth, often described the excellence and the majesty of the word. Indeed, Lactantius regards Hermes Trismegistus as one of the most important of the Gentile seers and prophets who foresaw the coming of Christianity, because he spoke of the Son of God and of the Word. In 3 passages of the Institutes he cites Trismegistus with the Sibyls as testifying to the coming of Christ. Lactantius nowhere says anything against Hermes Trismegistus. He is always the most ancient and all-wise writer, the tenor of whose works is agreeable to Christianity and whose mention of God the Son places him with the Sibyls as a Gentile prophet. In general passages Lactantius condemns the worshipping of images, and he also thinks that the demons used by Magi are evil fallen angels. These things are, however, never associated by him with Trismegistus, who always appears as a revered authority on divine truths. It is no wonder that Lactantius became a favorite father for the Renaissance magus who wished to remain a Christian. Augustine was, however, a difficulty for the Renaissance magus who wished to remain a Christian, for Augustine in the De Civitate delivers a severe condemnation of what Hermes the Egyptian, called Trismegistus, wrote concerning idols, that is to say of the passage in the Asclepius, which he quotes at length, on how the Egyptians in their magical religion animated the statues of their gods by magic means, by drawing spirits into them. Augustine is using, not a Greek text of the Asclepius, as Lactantius had done, but the same Latin translation which we have, and which must therefore be at least as early as the 4th century. As mentioned before, this translation used to be attributed to Apuleius of Madara. The context in which Augustine makes his attack on the idolatrous passage in the Asclepius is important. He has been attacking magic in general and in particular the views on spirits or demons held by Apuleius of Madara. Apuleius of Madara is a striking example of one of those men, highly educated in the general culture of the Greco-Roman world who, weary of the stale teachings of the schools, sought for salvation in the occult, and particularly in the Egyptian type of the occult. Born circa AD 123, Apuleius was educated at Carthage and at Athens and later travelled to Egypt where he became involved in a lawsuit in which he was accused of magic. He is famous for his wonderful novel, popularly known as The Golden Ass, the hero of which is transformed by witches into an ass, and after many sufferings in his animal form, is transformed back into human shape after an ecstatic vision of the goddess Isis, which comes to him on a lonely seashore whither he has wandered in despair. Eventually he becomes a priest of Isis in an Egyptian temple. The whole mood of this novel, with its ethical theme, its ecstatic initiation or illumination, its Egyptian coloring, is like the mood of the Hermetic writings. Though Apuleius was not really the translator of the Asclepius, that work would certainly have appealed to him. Augustine calls Apuleius a Platonist, and he attacks him for the views on airy spirits or demons which he held to be intermediaries between gods and men in his work on the Demon of Socrates. Augustine regards this as impious, not because he disbelieves in airy spirits or demons but because he thinks they are wicked spirits or devils. He then goes on to attack Hermes Trismegistus for praising the Egyptians for the magic by which they drew such spirits or demons into the statues of their gods, thus animating the statues, or making them into gods. Here he quotes verbally the god-making passage in the Asclepius. He then discusses the prophecy that the Egyptian religion will come to an end, and the lament for its passing, which he interprets as a prophecy of the ending of idolatry by the coming of Christianity. Here too, therefore, Hermes Trismegistus is a prophet of the coming of Christianity, but all credit for this is taken away by Augustine's statement that he had this foreknowledge of the future from the demons whom he worshipped. Hermes presages these things as the devil's confederate, suppressing the evidence of the Christian name, and yet foretelling with a sorrowful intimation, that from it should proceed the wreck of all their idolatrous superstitions, for Hermes was one of those who, knowing God, glorified him not as God, nor were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was full of darkness. Yet, continues Augustine, this Hermes says much of God according to the truth, though in his admiration for the Egyptian idolatry he was blind, and his prophecy of its passing he had from the devil. In contrast, he quotes a true prophet, like Isaiah, who said, "The idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of her." Augustine says nothing whatever about Hermes' mention of the Son of God, and his whole treatment of the subject is perhaps, in part, a reply to Lactantius' glorification of Hermes as a Gentile prophet. Augustine thus confirmed with the great weight of his authority the extreme antiquity of Hermes Trismegistus, who was long before the sages and philosophers of Greece. And by giving him a genealogy, whereby he is dated 3 generations later than a contemporary of Moses, Augustine raised a question which was to be much debated concerning the relative dates of Moses and Hermes. Was Hermes slightly later than Moses, though much earlier than the Greeks? As Augustine said, was he contemporary with Moses, or earlier than Moses? All these views were to be held by later Hermetists and Magi. The need to date him in relation to Moses was stimulated by the affinities with Genesis which must strike every reader of the Hermetic Bemunda. From other early Christian writers, more about Hermes Trismegistus could be learned, particularly from Clement of Alexandria, who, in his striking description of the procession of the Egyptian priests, says that the singer at the head of the procession carried 2 books of music and hymns by Hermes, the horoscopus carried 4 books by Hermes on the stars. In the course of this description, Clement states that there are 42 books by Hermes Trismegistus, 36 of which contain the whole of the philosophy of the Egyptians, the other 6 being on medicine. It is very improbable that Clement knew any of the Hermetica which have come down to us, but the Renaissance reader believed that he had in the Corpus Hermeticum and the Asclepius precious survivors of that great sacred library of which Clement speaks. About 1460, a Greek manuscript was brought to Florence from Macedonia by a monk, one of those many agents employed by Cosimo de' Medici to collect manuscripts for him. It contained a copy of the Corpus Hermeticum, not quite a complete copy, for it included 14 only of the 15 treatises of the collection, the last one being missing. Though the Plato manuscripts were already assembled, awaiting translation, Cosimo ordered Ficino to put these aside and to translate the work of Hermes Trismegistus at once, before embarking on the Greek philosophers. It is Ficino himself who tells us this, in that dedication to Lorenzo de' Medici of the Platonist commentaries in which he describes the impetus given to Greek studies by the coming of Gemistus Pletho and other Byzantine scholars to the Council of Florence, and how he himself was commissioned by Cosimo to translate the treasures of Greek philosophy now coming into the West from Byzantium. Cosimo, he says, had handed over to him the works of Plato for translation. But in the year 1463 word came to Ficino from Cosimo that he must translate Hermes first, at once, and go on afterwards to Plato. Ficino made the translation in a few months, whilst the old Cosimo, who died in 1464, was still alive. Then he began on Plato. It is an extraordinary situation. There are the complete works of Plato, waiting, and they must wait whilst Ficino quickly translates Hermes, probably because Cosimo wants to read him before he dies. What a testimony this is to the mysterious reputation of the thrice great one. Cosimo and Ficino knew from the fathers that Hermes Trismegistus was much earlier than Plato. They also knew the Latin Asclepius which whetted the appetite for more ancient Egyptian wisdom from the same pristine source. Egypt was before Greece, Hermes was earlier than Plato. What Yates reconstructs here is a crisis of intellectual authority that shaped Renaissance magic fundamentally. 2 church fathers read the same Hermetic texts and reached opposite conclusions. Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, saw Hermes as a pagan prophet whose invocation of the Son of God and the Word placed him in alignment with Christian theology, a Gentile witness to truths that Christianity would later reveal fully. Augustine, writing a century later with fiercer theological precision, saw the same passages and concluded that Hermes' ability to prophesy at all came from demons, making him spiritually unreliable even when accidentally correct. The magic in the Asclepius, the vivification of statues through the binding of spirits, Augustine explicitly condemned as demonic practice. The genius of Yates's analysis lies in showing how Renaissance magicians exploited the ambiguity between these 2 authorities. If you wanted to practice magic and remain Christian, Lactantius offered you cover. Hermes was ancient, authoritative, and his teaching aligned with Christian doctrine on the Word. Augustine offered you something different. proof that the texts were dangerous, which meant they were powerful. Some magicians adopted the strategy of claiming that the objectionable passages, the ones Augustine quoted about animating statues, were later interpolations, corruptions added by lesser minds to the pure Egyptian original. Others, like Giordano Bruno, would later abandon the compromise entirely and argue that Egyptian magical religion was not corrupt at all, but the truest religion, and that Christianity had obscured it. But all of them needed Hermes to be ancient, earlier than Plato, closer to Moses, originating in Egypt before Greece had a philosophy. That genealogical problem, planted by Augustine himself when he dated Hermes 3 generations after Moses, became the obsession of Renaissance Hermetists. The entire intellectual edifice of Renaissance magic depends on getting the dating right, on making Hermes old enough to be authoritative and early enough to predate any charge of being derivative from Christianity. Yates's most devastating insight comes at the end. Cosimo de' Medici, dying, ordered Ficino to translate Hermes before Plato. The complete works of the fountainhead of Western philosophy could wait. A fragmentary collection of Egyptian wisdom, half of which Augustine had called demonic, could not. This was not scholarship. This was hunger, the hunger of a dying man to touch something more ancient than reason, more authentic than system. And that hunger, Yates suggests, is what the Renaissance really was, not a recovery of classical learning, but an occult reordering of the entire spiritual hierarchy of the West. Next, Marsilio Ficino, 3 books on life. The Spitzen-Körper Thelema. If this archive serves you, support it on Patreon. Link in the description.